Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk. It will not come as a surprise to anyone that we've had a range of environmental injustices that have negatively impacted generations of Bronxites. Well, last month, the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice released the city's first comprehensive study on environmental inequality. It includes a fascinating and useful interactive map that not only details environmental hazards, but shows exactly where they are so that advocates and legislators can begin to unravel some of our most impactful environmental issues. Tonight, we're going to have a look at that comprehensive map and maybe also outline some steps that can get us to a point of equality rather than the inequalities that we've suffered in the Bronx for so long. Please join me in welcoming the Deputy Executive Director of the Mayor's Office of Climate Environmental Justice. It is Paul Onyx Lozito. Mr. Lozito, nice to have you with us.
It's a privilege. Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us. As we've just discussed, I really was inspired by the map. I thought it was really a revelation given the history that I just documented there. So who put it together? What was the idea behind it? And folks, we are going to show you, exactly what it looks like and how you might be able to learn some stuff about your own community. So go ahead, where do we start?
Thank you. Well, I think we should probably start with at the beginning, where the environmental justice initiative was spurned from a 2017 law, local law 60 and 64, which requires the city to identify issues of environmental justice and remedy those issues. From there, what we did was we convened an expert panel of nationally and locally recognized environmental justice advocates. The Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice did this. And we also convened 19 city agencies in an interagency working group to work through the issues. From there, we solicited comments from the community. We reviewed over 1,000 comments. We talked with local
Boy, if you come to the Bronx, you get 1.4 million comments, but that's another story.
Yes. We talked to a lot of nonprofit partners. We've talked to a lot of people on the ground in the Bronx and citywide.
Yes, I didn't mean to say that you didn't come to the Bronx. I was making a bad joke.
Of course.
But what I like, and we'll do that toward the end of the program, is you said, and remedy those issues. That is, of course, the bottom line of the whole thing. What I was impressed about in learning about it, you spent a lot of time. It wasn't one of those things that said, okay, we got to get it done in a couple of months, and so let's put it together. You gave it the time to really be able to do a comprehensive look at not only the Bronx, but the entire city of New York, which is not that small.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the reason why it took so much time is because some of these issues are old as time. You know, when you look at some of the results from the report, 67% of the neighborhoods are actually correlate to neighborhoods that were historically redlined, and redlining stems back from the 1930s. So in order to actually identify how we're going to solve issues moving into the future, we had to really take the time, talk to the community partners, talk to our city agency partners, figure out what we've done that could be catalyzed to actually solve issues, and what we need to do that could inform the result.
Well, one of the things I hear all the time from longtime Bronxites is this has been going on forever. They come up with, a Band-Aid solution, but they never really get to it. It seems to me this actually gives us the foundation to really do it, to really take a look at what's going on.
That's absolutely right. I mean, the report that we finalized has the mapping tool that we've been starting to talk about.
We're going to show it. Don't go away.
And what the mapping tool is intended to do is for you to be able to zoom in on your neighborhood, see what the environmental issue is. You can see, because you can click through the mapping tool to see what the issue is of air quality, what the issues are of flooding, heat risk, a myriad of other issues. And then you can ask the city, you can ask your local elected, hey, how is this going to be remedied? Concurrently, we're going to work on something called the EJNYC plan to remedy the issues outlined in the report that you'll be able to, that you can visualize in the mapping tool.
Where does the word injustice come in? And I don't mean to be snarky about it, but there are things, I suppose, that we can't control that are not the best things, for us health-wise and environmentally. But where does it cross the line to say, well, this is kind of acceptable, but that's injustice?
I think the easiest way to look at environmental justice is around fairness. So a kid in the Upper East Side and a kid in the South Bronx should be able to go to the playground, enjoy a high quality, a good air quality, have good equipment to play on, have adequate places to rest from extreme heat during the summer, have access to a pool, and be able to enjoy their day in the same way as a kid in the Upper East Side.
We did a couple of shows with the Racial Justice Commission, which recently passed through the electoral process. I'm guessing that this is part of that dialogue to say, you know what, let's really look at New York City and make sure that that all peoples, regardless of their status and regardless, of course, of their ethnicity, have equal opportunity for safe and happy communities.
Absolutely. There are lots of different ways to look at that. Our approach really stems from what environmental risks that you have, because we're the Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. So what we're trying to do is use like real data we have around climate and say, hey, this community is more prone to flooding, and because
and that brings up one question before we start looking at the map and all that stuff. What did you learn, or what does it show us about the Bronx compared to other boroughs? Because we are very self-conscious about it.
Sure.
We're very upset about things that we know that are unjust. And was there something to learn about the Bronx that maybe doesn't affect Queens or Brooklyn or Manhattan and Staten Island? Or is it really very similar in so-called marginalized communities all over the city?
I think that what's really helpful about the EJNYC report and the mapping tools, that it really goes down to neighborhood by neighborhood.
More so than borough lines. And so if we have more communities that are affected, well, that's, I'm sure people in Queens will say, wait a minute, what about us? Anyway, all right, so we have this little video. I want to show this little video, which is very short, but it'll give folks a chance to see what it's about. And then we're going to pull out some pieces of it, and you can help us understand what that is. So through the magic of TV, let's take a look.
You will find 6 thematic maps that contain a curated selection of datasets most relevant to the map's overall theme. Those themes are access to resources, polluted air, hazardous materials, safe and healthy housing, polluted water, and climate change.
And there you go. That's just a sample, and all the categories which, again, people of the Bronx talk about polluted air, talk about hazardous materials, talk about this in our neighborhoods, safe and affordable housing, et cetera, et cetera. Let's do this. I want to show, let's take a look at one slice of what it looks like for the Bronx and how the map addresses, for example, polluted air. We've got a couple of pictures. So here's in the Bronx, and you can see each one of those dots, I guess, each one of those notes show us where there are, concentrations of polluted air. And then when you go in, for folks who go into the map and you click the map, the next picture will show you exactly what you will see. So this shows that over there in, I guess it's in Soundview, that there's a bus depot. And presumably that is one of the real big issues in air quality, right? And I guess that you can click and see in your neighborhood where there are those pockets.
Absolutely.
In terms of the research, you went around with data collectors, those kinds of things, to measure those things?
So in order to amass the research, we worked with all of our city partners. So we have city agency partners that helped us, who actually measure air quality, aggregate that, and they helped us to identify where in each neighborhood we had issues related to air quality. And those issues range. So when you talk about issues along the Cross Bronx Expressway, which you reflected.
Excuse me,
Sure.
There were so many dots around the Cross Bronx Expressway.
Right.
I said it wouldn't have been clear because people would say, well,
Right.
yes, of course.
Right.
But just to pull out one of our neighborhoods in
Sure.
Soundview and show that's why I did that. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Absolutely.
I couldn't resist.
Absolutely. And what was really helpful about the map you showed was there were different reasons why air quality was poor. So there's different solutions that we have to come up with. So
right. And so in your neighborhood, folks, when you click on and say, oh, what do I have in wherever I am in Mott Haven or in Highbridge or any one of our neighborhoods, you may see a bus depot, or you may see something else.
Right.
And so, okay, we'll talk about solutions. I'm always thinking about solutions, but let's do another one, which is hazardous materials. I thought this was interesting. And so here are, what are hazardous materials? What do these circles show actually?
So those break down site by site. Hazardous materials could be pollutants into waterways. They could be heavy metals. They could be hazardous materials that are a result of an adjacent industrial area. It really does range and vary.
It ranges and varies. And also what is nice about the whole map is that you can compare the Bronx, like I was talking about comparing the Bronx to other neighborhoods or other boroughs. You can see how much of it is ours and how much of it is somebody else. So in this case, which was where? I didn't see which. Oh, this is Community District 6, so it's one that's highlighted in blue. Once you click it, it shows you the district. And in that case, there's chemically intensive small businesses in Community District 6. Now that's interesting because we certainly don't want to close down small businesses, but maybe we can outfit them so that they're not polluted.
That's exactly right.
Wow. Okay, there was another one. Now this is a big thing too. I happen to live near the Major Deegan, and so here's one for housing quality. Oh, I was talking about the projected storm surge, but here's housing quality. And this was also fascinating because if you look on the right, it tells with the lighter colors, that is where there is housing without air conditioning access. Look how much of the Bronx has lighter colors. That was one I wanted to point up because that is really scary.
Absolutely, and I'm glad that you brought up that map. Black and brown communities historically have less access to air conditioning units, and the actual biggest climate killer in New York City is extreme heat events where people die in the middle of the summer. So,
really, that's fascinating.
Right, and it's important to point out the solution now that people should call 311 to get access to the HEAP program. There's opportunities for lower income individuals to get free air conditioners.
But again, that map was maybe we could just put that up again if we could. That map was particularly interesting to me. So in the eastern part of the borough, both north and south, it seems there is more air conditioning, and then up in Williamsbridge, kind of halfway in the 50th percentile. But then there you go to Soundview, Concourse Village, Mott Haven, all of our neighborhoods, Fordham, Bedford Park, even up in Riverdale, there's not sufficient. That is, again, to me, remarkable. How do you measure that? I mean, you count the air conditioners on a building? I mean,
I would have to defer to our partners with DOHMH, but they do
in.
surveys and they have a better sense of it. But the information is robust, it's true, it's valid, and it's important because what it does is it allows us to identify that Black and brown communities have lack of access, and we need to change our programs to help solve for that.
Incredibly fascinating,
Yeah.
I thought, and I'd never heard the statistic about heat being that dangerous. I mean, we know
Yes.
things happen, and of course, as things get warmer, talk about climate change, it's going to not get better. Was there one more for projected storm surge? Let's take a look at that one. Now, this was also interesting. Of course, our coastal communities are endangered in that way, and that's pretty obvious. But this really looks at the 2020s and 2080s. Talk, if you would, a little bit about what that is representing.
So what that represents is the risk as it changes over time. So what we try to do is we try to project into the future where the risk is going to be so that we can design for infrastructure projects to reduce the risk from storm surge. What you're really seeing here, right, is the neighborhood by neighborhood effect of climate risk, right? So you see in the East Bronx, in this particular map, that there's high flood risk, and we need to use this data on 2020s and 2080 storm surge to design infrastructure that takes years to design to solve those risks. In the last map, you saw extreme heat risk. Extreme heat risk was along the concourse spine, right?
Right,
But,
all the way down.
Right, all the way down. But that was not a high flood neighborhood. So that's the goal of this tool, is to say, in this neighborhood, the solutions need to be targeted this way. In this other neighborhood, the solutions need to be targeted this way.
So our friends on City Island who talk all the time about, it rains and we all get flooded.
Right.
we understand that, and then we won't ignore it because we'll say, wait a minute, you can't
Right.
know this is a problem. The other thing that I liked about that one, that's why I was mentioning the Major Deegan, and I live near the Deegan. We had that storm, and that got flooded. Why don't you talk? We've talked about it on our program. Why don't you talk about the importance of the daylighting of Tibbetts Brook and how that will impact positively what had happened at that time on the Major Deegan Expressway?
So the Major Deegan Expressway is at a low point. I think what the goal is of daylighting Tibbetts Brook and the goal of expanding our sewer system and our stormwater combined sewer outflow system is to make sure that when it rains, our system can handle it. Our system can either locate water outside of our combined sewer system so that it doesn't overwhelm it in a storm event and flood low points like the Major Deegan Expressway or other parts of our neighborhood. Or we can make improvements to our system so it can better handle the water as it comes from the sky more rapidly. Our current system is designed generally to take less than 1 or 2 inches of water per hour. What we're seeing is persistent and consistent events. I think Ida's a good example where we saw almost 10 inches an hour in parts of New York
Wow.
City. Our system cannot handle that. So daylighting places like the Tibbetts Brook, reducing our impervious pavement, so like digging up sidewalk and putting in greener footprints allows us to collect water in ways so that it doesn't overwhelm our system at a later time.
I was talking with some folks who were putting together a panel discussion about healthcare in the Bronx. And of course, it's our largest industry. We can talk about our hospitals. We can talk about insurance. We can talk about access to healthcare. But one of the things that underscored it was, if you want to talk about healthcare, we have to talk about the nature of our housing. If you want to talk about healthcare, we have to talk about the nature of our communities, the access to parkland and all those kinds of things. Seems to me there is a similar process here. If we're going to talk about climate change and the environment, it's not only the Center for Hazardous Materials, it's also the nature of the infrastructure of the entire city. You just talked about, sidewalks and concrete and all those kinds of things.
Absolutely.
Were you surprised with any of the findings?
What was interesting
Because
about
everything that you've said, certainly for us in the Bronx, is logical to me. I mean,
Right.
I've been sitting in this seat a long time and I've heard it. But for you, was there anything that surprised you?
What was really important about the report was the intersection of the information. This is the first time we're bringing all of this information and representing it in one place. So can you say on the Grand Concourse, it's hotter in the middle of the summer than in the East Bronx? Yes. But then looking at the vulnerability in the community as it relates to the impacts of heat, that's new. And that is the information that we really discovered through this process.
And we did a show with the New York Power Authority, and one of the questions logically that came up was about the peaker plants. And when I asked, I said, people in the South Bronx are like, so when are we going to decommission them? I think it was in relation to the governor spending like $3.2 billion on energy infrastructure in the city, and yet it somehow X'd out and exempted the peaker plants from being shut down. So I asked them, what is the plan for shutting those down and finally relieving at least some of the air problems in the South Bronx? And their response was, well, it's planned for 2035. And I was like, that is really not much comfort to what we're going through. So I guess my question is, so what happens now after this report? And now that you've got an office and you've got this infrastructure, both map-wise and personnel-wise, does it go toward legislation? Do you go to developers? I mean, how do you work this so that we can really make changes, so we can look at maybe some of the businesses in Community Board 6 and say, it's clear now that you're providing, hazardous, materials into our community. How do we deal with this? What do we do?
Absolutely. So we're at the point now where we did the report. The report identifies the issues. We have the map that illustrates the report. Now we have to go through a planning effort. This is going to be a year-long effort with the communities. We're going to meet with community leaders locally. We'll say, these are the issues we found. Let's work with you on identifying solutions for each of the issues in the report. So that could be updates to existing programs. We're looking at using this report as a huge catalyst to pursue federal and state resources to build infrastructure projects and the city's been doing that for years, but this is going to amplify those efforts, particularly in Black and brown neighborhoods. The Biden administration has a commitment to what it calls EJ or Environmental Justice 40 it's Environmental Justice 40 initiative, and so we're pursuing resources that are prioritized for historically ignored communities from the federal government, and that's like one clear way we're going to use the information we have now. So.
And one of the reasons that I wanted to make sure to show it to my friends and neighbors in the Bronx is you can see in your neighborhood, and you may not be aware that there was a hazardous materials issue, or that the local bus depot that's been there for 80 years, you now realize, wait a minute, this is actually a problem. And then when you hear about a conversion to electric buses, you will be a little more favorable, or at least understand it. And this is a question you can't answer, and I apologize, but it involves money. I mean, let's be real here. I mean, the daylighting of Tibbetts Brook took 20 years to figure out how to do that and to get the resources. I mean, ultimately Chuck Schumer came by and all that. I guess the thing is partially what I do for a living, and that is put stuff out so that it can get in people's heads, right? I mean, that's a large part of what this is about.
Education is key, and that's why we daylighted the report and the mapping tool at the Boys and Girls Club in Queens, because we wanted to make sure to educate not only our wider population, but focus on children who will be our leaders in the future, who will be dealing with and solving some of these issues, because this is a decades-long set of issues to discover by and through environmental justice and climate change.
I had to laugh about the 2080s, 2020 and 2080s. I mean, barring a very large miracle, I will not be here in 2080, but some of those young people might be. Yes. So that certainly would make a difference. In your mind, is there a biggest issue that, like after you hear all of the all the comments from everybody, in your mind, is there something that you say, this is what we got to do? Or do you see all of these issues, the polluted air, the hazardous materials, the air conditioning issue, as one? Or do you say, this has to be first?
I think what we're focusing on now is really just listening to the community. I think that we've seen citywide, we need to plant more trees. That's one thing that we can do. Reducing
certainly
the amount
for air quality.
Yes, for air quality, for extreme heat.
And if I can just interject on that point, you can do more in a moment.
Sure.
But the trees is a relatively easy thing to do compared to, daylighting a brook or something like that, right? I mean, identify some place, plant some trees.
But there's a disparity between tree coverage in the Bronx and in other neighborhoods that are not categorized as EJ. So.
Oh, that's fascinating.
That's the issue.
In other words, where are you going to plant those trees? And there's, of course, a little funding involved. And then, of course, the Parks Department will say, wait a minute, we don't have the money to do it, so you got to get somebody else to do it, et cetera, et cetera. And that brings up yet another issue here. And I'm hoping that this map and this concept can have some influence on budgeting. I mean, if we're talking about environmental quality and access, for example, to parks, the Bronx is known as the borough of parks, we're still fighting to get that 1% of funding to our parks. That concept would be part of this effort, I'm assuming.
So in the report, we recommend that we integrate addressing environmental justice through climate budgeting. This administration has also announced climate budgeting for the first time, and that report is now out. And so our goal is into the future to measure how much we are investing in environmental justice communities on an annual basis across city government.
That would be a fascinating report, a fascinating number to see, well, this community got, this community didn't, or the need was this big, but they didn't, you know what I mean? To me, that would be a very big thing. One of the other things that came up, which we didn't directly talk about, was the airports and other transportation facilities. How big an issue in our general climate, because the traffic is everywhere, the buses and subways, we know what goes on in New York City, of course our airports, the two here in New York and of course Newark. How central are they to the whole report and to the dangers to our communities?
It's neighborhood by neighborhood. So if you're a coastal neighborhood, say where a cruise ship docks, then you may see a different impact than, say, a neighborhood that is, further inland. If you live closer to JFK Airport, you're going to see different impacts than if you're further from the airport. Same is true of LaGuardia. Here in the Bronx, when it comes to infrastructure impacts, really what you're seeing, or city infrastructure impacts, the peaker plants obviously come up as a significant
And the other thing, I did
issue.
click a lot of those circles. Many of them were bus depots.
Right.
That was also a
Right.
very big thing.
And we're working with the Department of Education to electrify our bus system. We just are pursuing resources now from the federal government to plan for what that transition looks like. So many of the dots in that first chart that you provided
Right.
are meant to be addressed by and through that initiative.
I'm thrilled to hear that. We're going to be getting 4 Metro North stations, mentioning transportation. It's going to take a little while. There's a lot of talk about exactly how to develop and what to do around those stations, et cetera, et cetera. Presumably, you think this is a good thing.
It's definitely a good thing. The reason why it's a good thing is because taking transit versus driving a car will reduce emissions in that area. It will also provide access to jobs for folks as a key driver to reducing an impact.
What do you see as the next step? Now that you've done this, we're almost out of time here, but now that you've done this, what do you see as the next step? Is it really, as you said, you're going to be talking to communities, but then once you get all that information, is it lobbying? Is it, bringing
Applying for
people?
federal resources, applying for state resources, looking at the programs that we have now and seeing if we miss anything that could really reach an environmental justice community, looking at whether or not there is legislation that we should pursue to address some of the issues that are in these neighborhoods.
Boy, I'd love to see a meeting with every level of governmental officials, elected leaders, to really say, hey, look, this is your neighborhood, this is your district, these are the problems you have. Let's talk about getting the funding to and the attention to deal with it. Listen, I'm thrilled with this. I think this was a really, really important thing to show the people of the Bronx. I'm thrilled with the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice.
Thank you.
And Paul Onyx Lozito, thank you so much for joining us. And onward and upward, let's build a safer, cleaner, and more wonderful New York City and Bronx.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Okay, folks, that will do it. We thank our producer, Rebecca Hemick. Our director is Will Guzman. The editor is Diaz. We have a cast of thousands working for us here in the studio. And of course, to you too, the people of the Bronx, we love you. So, if the curtain don't fall and the creek don't rise, I'll be back next week. Good night.